And the bulk of the questions, I'd really like to focus on how does this work? Like on whether it's the pay equity stuff or whether it's the parental leave, to really just try to set the stage for what we're talking about. Hi everybody and welcome. My name is Peter Armstrong. I'm the host of On the Money here on CBC, the business program on CBC. We are now 2 hours and 5 minutes after the federal budget has come out. We've all started to pour through it. We'll get more information as the day goes on for sure, but we want to have a chance to chat with you about how this impacts you and your life, the questions you have about what these policy implications are, what these levers that have been pulled out of Ottawa, how they're going to functionally change for your life. I'm joined by Lesley Ann Scorgie, as an author, columnist, a well-known personality, author of Well Heeled, The Smart Girl's Guide to Getting Rich, The Modern Couple's Money Guide. Lots of money guides. The one thing, I mean, there's $21.5 billion in new spending. We can talk about the deficit. The thing you and I have been talking about the most in leading up to this has been, how is this new parental leave stuff going to work?
Right.
Because it's not new money, it's just giving more people access to the same pot of money,
That's right. So the theory here is that by allowing an extra 5 weeks for the other spouse to be at home with the child, that could allow for, let's say, the mother who is on parental leave to head back to the workforce a little bit sooner, so she misses a fewer weeks every year, and that she gets right back to earning a much higher income. The other thing that we have talked about is the fact that when she or the other spouse is on parental leave, they are earning a significantly reduced income compared to what they were when they were earning a full salary. So we're talking like 50% up to a maximum. So
man, you got to plan that way ahead. This isn't a, oh, hey, I have more access to it, I'll take a week too.
That's right. You know, the maximum benefit for a parent is only about $540 every week. So when you compare that to full salary, you are having to take a big haircut on your take-home pay.
Indeed. And we want to dig into the broader issues here about how does this actually sort of address gender pay equity, and how does this, get into a gender balanced budget. But I really just want to invite you at home watching this on your phone, on your computer, whatever it may be, get involved in this conversation. Send your questions. They're going to be routed through to me on this handy computer here, so I'll have a good sense, and they're already starting to come in. Jackie Lee interested about pharmacare, and I do want to dig into that because it's really interesting. It would be a huge step forward, but we don't have almost any information and no money allocated to it, which is, I think, even more important.
That's
Nardo Barati Dumaquati asks, is the paternity leave on top of the 18 months of parental leave?
So my understanding is that it is an extra 5 weeks. So that would be on top of.
The other thing that when we look at a lot of this, whether there was that, I think it was the McKinsey Group came out with a report earlier in the year saying if we can increase the women participation rate in the labor force, so the amount of Canadian women that are working in the labor force, if we can increase that from its current rate of, I think it's 61% to 64%, that would add $63 billion Canadian GDP. So the whole idea here is what kind of policy levers can we pull that will increase the number of women that are working in the workforce. But I think, and again, you and I were talking about this before we came on, it's almost as much about trying to normalize the conversation around people coming and going and leaving the workforce and getting back in without being penalized.
That's right. What is fascinating is just how big that boost would be if more women were back to work. So the government has tabled a budget that is trying to use gender parity as an economic engine. And we're also seeing this, it's fascinating, in the financial markets. You have gender diverse ETFs like HERS.
These are the exchange traded funds that are passively managed rather than a mutual fund where you're individually picking stocks. These are getting a little bit more actively managed in terms of you're picking companies that are gender diverse.
That's right. So you're seeing a trend. You've got the government tabling a budget that has some gender diversity lens to it. And then you have the financial markets also doing the same thing, where they're saying these companies, when they choose gender diverse policies and practices, produce higher revenues and net incomes. So that is very good, because that is the economic engine that continues to grow the Canadian economy.
Yin Pang asks, how are they changing the laws around passive income for small business corporations? You've been following this debate. It has been so fractious and so intense. The basic answer is on the passive income, we heard earlier from the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, who his line was, Dan Kelly's line was that it's a slightly less bad budget in that we did get some clarity. They did get some changes. The passive investment threshold was at $50,000. So if you invest however much money in a passive investment through your corporation, you pay that smaller business tax rate on your investment earnings. So not the investment, not how much you put into the passive investment fund, but the earnings you make off that of $50,000. They've raised that to $150,000, which, I mean, if you're trading at, say, 7%, you're looking at $1.5 million in savings that are put into that investment fund and the growth of $150,000. So that's the short answer to that. But there are going to be lots of conversations around how that very stormy subject of business and small business taxation actually played out through this budget. Mary Haggart asks, when does disabled and seniors and vets money go up? Do you know anything about that?
I do not know. I do not.
So one of the things we really do try to do, and I've done a number of these, I try really hard to make sure I go back in the comments and answer the questions that I don't have the answer to. I certainly don't have all the answers. Lesley-Ann doesn't have them either. We'll get back to the ones that we do have and be sure that we can try to get to some of those. Davy Clinton Connaughton asks, I'm a husband to a disabled woman and father of 3 under the age of 10. Our household gross is less than $90,000. And since income splitting was canceled and the child fitness credit was canceled, I seem to be out $3,000. Is there anything in this budget for my family? Is there anything that you noticed?
Well, the child benefit was improved a few years ago.
Right.
And so what that is doing is it is adding more income back into households, just like this man's household.
Right.
So that is a step in the right direction. The one thing I want to just highlight here is if it were available to this individual, what you could do is use spousal RRSPs as a way to move money from the higher spouse's income to the other spouse who has a lesser income. So that is not income splitting, but it is the effective use of spousal
it's an
RRSP.
interesting sort of workaround.
So you would get some money saved on taxes. Now, I understand in this kind of situation, you might not have a lot of money for RRSP.
What do you tell people? Because a lot of your business is around sort of coaching and helping people understand. When something like that happens, and you're all of a sudden, you're probably pretty strapped at $90,000 for a family of 5, and getting by, but every penny's probably allotted, and then you lose a bit of money. What is your advice to people to get through until they can figure out how to bridge that, how to manage that better?
So the first and easiest step is to have a quick look at your budget and cut any recurring payments. What you're trying to do at that point is I call it stopping the bleeding. So we're looking for a few $100s a month in the budget that could actually close that gap and make sure that you balance every month.
But that's hard. I mean, I know people that can't find 20 or 40 bucks.
Do you know, I find though in our business, when I look at someone's budget, someone that has gone back and looked for opportunities for savings, if we do it together, there's often ways to trim back, even in small increments. So if you got the full, cable television, maybe you are making a change.
Don't have to cut the cord, but you can probably bring the package down.
That's right. So you're looking for smaller things, and what I like to refer to that as is death by 1,000 financial paper cuts. So those.
But you can make up a lot of ground if you can do that. For sure.
You can, yeah.
Okay, Tessa McCumber asks my favorite question: what is happening for seniors? And the reason this is my favorite question is I wrote a column that we'll put up in the comments last week, setting up the budget. And the first thing I did was I set out to ask, what is the biggest single expense in any federal budget? The federal budget's about $311 billion. What do you think the single biggest expense is? Do you know?
I do not. I would think.
A lot of people think it would be healthcare.
Yeah, I would think healthcare.
A lot of people always say paying down the debt, which is not. It's quite small. And national defense. The biggest single expense in any federal budget in Canada, going back a number of years, is elderly benefits.
Oh,
and it
wow.
remains that today. I checked those numbers again to make sure I was right. Transfers to the individual always make up about a quarter of any sort of budget. Transfers to the province makes up another quarter. And then if you work in defense, crown corporations, and debt spending, that's another almost 30%.
Right.
So right there, all of that almost immovable.
Yeah.
And you're looking at almost 80%. And all of this stuff that we talk about, whether it's gender pay equity or innovation or jobs and skills and training, whatever it may be, all of that, we're arguing about this like 18 to 20% sliver of the big sort of portion of the budget. But what is happening for seniors? Seniors still get an enormous amount of money through the federal government. The single biggest expenditure in the federal budget is, and has been for some time, transfers to elderly people. I didn't see anything in particular that jumps out at me that is new to this, but it is also really important to, like, there are some really big and ambitious ideas in this, but this is a real A, political document, and B, a third budget that we're waiting. This sets us up incredibly for
next
a 2019 budget, which is a pre-election, and boy, you can bet everybody in a pre-election year is going to see an awful lot of goodies, right? That's kind of how this works.
That's right, and right now people are talking about this as being a little lackluster and not too many surprises in this budget, but next year maybe there'll be some additional changes.
How important is it that they have to just sort of come out and lay your cards on the table and say, this is about gender balance and this is a gender balance approach to budgeting, whether this, they haven't injected specific funds into specific programs in a way that I think you could say, oh, well, I can understand how that has an impact on that. But how important is it to say that's what we're doing here and to send that message out?
I think it is right now the right time to be having this conversation. I wish we had had this conversation 10 years ago, but I'm grateful that it is on the table right now. I think what the government has done is brought a lens of gender-based analysis to the spotlight, and we, as all Canadians, business owners, those that are working in schools and communities, we can actually take that example and now apply it to the way we run our businesses, the way we run our communities. So, this is a bit of a political budget. It is about talking about the things that Canadians care about, and gender diversity is important. I think it's a great move. I'm excited about it.
I'm getting a note here. There's $1.4 billion over 3 years earmarked in new financing available for women entrepreneurs through the Business Development Bank of Canada, which is those are huge programs that can really move the needle on very specific issues.
Yeah, and what I am excited about is when I started my business, I actually used Business Development Bank of Canada, and I walked in there and I applied for my loan. Now I have extra funding as a woman entrepreneur to continue to grow my business. That gets me very excited, and these are local pockets, so they're going to work with local community organizations to identify women entrepreneurs that can really benefit. The other thing that we know is that when women entrepreneurs receive funding and they're growing their businesses effectively, they actually create more jobs than businesses that are male dominated.
And as long as we've been keeping that stat, have created more jobs. We all know that when there's more diversity in the C-suite of a business, the returns on that business are almost inevitably higher.
That's right.
This is good for everybody. And I want to come back to that McKinsey report, that if you can get from 61 to 64% labor participation of women in Canada, so that's not a big jump, right? That's a measurable, you can move the needle on that with really specific issues, and some of them are addressed in this. You're looking at adding $63 billion. That would cover 3 pharmacare plans. That would cover, 1.5 times the amount of money we're sending to elderly people every year, our single biggest expenditure. It's really hard to overstate how important to the broader economy this initiative can be.
I couldn't agree more. I think 4% bump in GDP because women become more active and empowered in the workforce, that is the number that we're looking at. That is many thousands of jobs, many better outcomes for families, for children. So I think that this is a fabulous lens to be applying to the budget. And let's not forget, as much as the budget is political, it is financial. Those are real numbers. That is an economic engine that is going to drive our economy and continue to grow it.
And no matter who you are, at whatever stage of the economy you're in, you are benefited by it. Like if Canada's GDP goes up, the corner store does a little bit better. The guy who runs a gas station, this is truly one of those tide that floats all boats. We touched on this earlier, this notion that if you can start to just change the conversation, if a couple of people, a couple of guys in all of those office towers just down the road, we're just down the road from Bay Street here, if a couple of them avail themselves of these extra 5 weeks of parental leave, and they leave the workforce to go help raise their children for a small but measurable amount of time, and then come back, how important can that be towards normalizing the conversation around coming and going and not being penalized when it comes to how much you get paid on a longer term arc of your career?
It's about establishing a new norm. Right. And when we start having men and women actively raising their children at home, it becomes normal to take a leave of absence for a specific period of time, return to work, and you are still empowered, making an excellent salary. So it is a perfect step to closing that gap. The real challenge here is when women leave the workforce for up to 52 weeks of maternity or parental leave, the issue is that they are not putting results on the table, they are not in the faces of their executive teams, they are not delivering for that whole year, and then they return to work with the hopes that they are going to be recognized for past performance and being given the opportunity to generate new projects, new value for their company. Really hard to do if you've been out for a length of time.
And if the conversation in the workplace is about how you've been out, rather than that just being a normal course of action that the workplace itself adapts to. Because as we all know, the data show workplaces in general are incredibly adaptable places. They can change, and social change has swept through workplaces before. We've seen this happen.
And we have some really progressive companies right here in Canada that have gender diverse policies and practices. One of my favorite interviews last year was with Equileap, and it is the company that ranks North Americans' top 3,000 companies on a gender diversity scale. And it looks at whether or not these organizations have policies and practices that protect and support women. And after their analysis, they found about 150 that were quite progressive. And out of 3,000, let's just be clear about that. But those are the companies, if I were in a position where I was looking for a new job that was based on my belief system and gender diversity, I would go to that list. I would check out that website. I would
it's almost like Glassdoor, like if we can get to a place where that's
right.
Sandra Owens asks, is there money for veterans? This is a big issue for me, and our producer Irene has sent me some notes on this for you, Sandra. That last year, Veterans Affairs Canada said 45,000 veterans' graves were in need of repair. This budget's earmarked $24.4 million over the next 5 years to restore and replace veterans' headstones. There's also a veterans charter starting in 2019, which is definitely very good to see. I just want to reset and remind you who we are, what we're doing here. My name is Peter Armstrong. I'm the host of On the Money on CBC News Network every day at 4 o'clock. When the markets close, we sort of sum up the business day for you, let you know what's happened, where things are going, why it should matter to you. Lesley-Ann Scorgie is author, business entrepreneur, founder of MeVest. What is MeVest?
We are money coaches. So we work with Canadians across the country to help them with their budgeting, making great decisions about their investing, and actually building confidence to manage their money really well.
We're trying to parse through a lot of what's in the budget, what's not in the budget, the specific numbers that go along with it, and they're all very important. But the economy is doing well. The economy is growing like gangbusters, and that has given the Canadian government more wiggle room than they had until quite recently. And yet, and I'd like to hear how this reflects on the ground for you, I get the sense that most Canadians are still incredibly nervous about their financial well-being, about how we're doing. Do you get that sense?
Absolutely. We see that every day, and it has a lot to do with the fact that Canadians are drowning in personal debt. Their mortgages are quite high, and their consumer debt, so lines of credit, credit cards, they're awfully high. So we're looking at Canadian households not having much more than about a month in emergency savings.
Oh, that's not.
Can you imagine having an emergency and not having a paycheck for a few months? You would have to dip further into debt to support yourself. So I understand the nervousness, and I always say, when times are good, like they are right now for a lot of households, save, pay down debt, because we're going to need that capacity when times are not so good and when the economy dips again.
Because borrowing money is going to get more expensive.
It is.
And people are turning more and more to payday loans, which is a spiraling problem.
Yeah.
And, we've had conversations about that on our show. Is there advice to navigating this? I mean, we've been hearing a lot about seniors. We've been hearing a lot about young parents, which are on sort of different sides of, maybe not the coin, but of the spectrum of the Canadian economy. That you have young parents that are out there just trying to figure out how to have these kids, baby startup is fiscal hell. And then all of these people, this enormous demographic boom that's going into their elderly years, enormous changes. With the young families, what is your first advice to them when they come in and they say, how on earth am I going to do? How am I going to pay for all this?
So the first thing is they really do need to become familiar with what benefits are available for them. So please go on the federal government website, and there is a button on there. It's really big, and it says determine my benefits. We want to focus on that first as a young family. Next, you are going to have to make some tough decisions. Do you do childcare at home? Do you do childcare in the traditional daycare system? We found out today in the budget that there's going to be more affordable childcare spaces made available. This is excellent news. And then you're having to look at a bit of a shift in a trend. We're returning back to a norm where there is multiple generations now caring for the total family. And this is a really cool trend. We're seeing it with our client base, seeing it in our own family, and we're having this larger conversation as it's becoming more expensive to live, where we're taking care of each other, we're sharing wealth, and we're distributing the workload. So the other thing here for new parents, young parents, is budgets, budgets, budgets. You can digitize them, you can draw them. It doesn't matter, but this is a guide. Every dollar has to have a job, and when you're in, I call it the dark years, we need to put those dollars to what is most important.
Indeed. We've got a question here from Danielle Perron asking, how about taxpayers who pay everything? What do I get? It is really important. This is one of my, one of the things I really love about the job that I'm in is it's important to go in and look at. It was on page 254 of last year's budget. It's in the second annex of this year's budget. I'll put up a specific link in these comments for you, Daniel, to go in and read and look at where your money actually goes. Because, like we were talking off the top, that single biggest expenditure is elderly people. I don't say that because there's anything wrong with it. I say it because I think it surprises people. And because how on earth can you debate what should be in or out of a budget until you really know where it all goes, right? If you were to sit down with a family and say, let's plan out your spending, the first thing you'd write down is, well, what's your mortgage payment? What's your childcare payment? What's your car payment? You get the big ones. Those are always at the top of the list. With federal budgets, it's often very hard to find because, as I say, about 80% of the spending is baked in. It's really, you can't move the needle very much on that. So we debate over the 18 or 20%. But I'll put up a link for you to read because I think it's really important for you to know that, because this is what it's all about, and it is, you're entirely right, it is your money. Doreen Robert Rounds on Facebook asks, what is happening with the annual deficits in the national debt with this budget? Very good question, very important question, because we had always talked about making sure that we kept that ratio below 1%. Economists say as long as it's below 1%, we go up to 0.9% in this budget. But the deficit info from our friend Nicole has sent this, one of the producers upstairs. $18.1 billion in projected deficit for 2018-19. That's including a $3 billion risk contingency fund, which they set aside in case things go horribly wrong, which we've needed in the past. Go back to 2008, go back to 2014 when the price of oil collapsed, though that is expected to fall to $12 12.3 billion by 2023, which then that brings it all the way down to 0.5%, which is, I know people get very worked up about this, and probably rightly so. Is your money. You definitely want to see that. Economists that sort of study the broader, larger picture often say below 1% isn't a big deal. Below
no one's ringing the bell.
Is right. Yeah. This is very much manageable. Steve Kosman asks, what was done to combat the U.S. corporate tax cuts? Really interesting, Steve, in that the federal finance minister talked about this before we went into the budget and said, we're not going to address that. We're going to do a bit of a fact-finding mission. We still don't really know the implications of the U.S. tax cuts and how that's going to play itself out. That's enormous deficit spending that they're using to fund that tax cut. So we knew going in there wasn't going to be anything. We certainly didn't get anything. We're not too long for this, so please do get your questions in about what do you want to know, what do you want to hear, and even if you don't make it past the wire and we wrap up, we do want to hear from you. I'm going to just check a couple more questions. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think people at home should be just trying to walk away from this understanding a little bit better, thinking more about?
Well, I thought it was quite interesting that conservation and cybersecurity also hit the budget.
It's quite right. We haven't hardly talked about that at all. Right?
And I got excited about that because I grew up in Alberta. I went through Banff National Park on a regular basis. I took advantage last year of the free park pass.
Right.
I am excited about
Where'd you
go? So I actually being fairly new to the Toronto area.
That's right, you moved from out west.
That's right. I discovered the Rouge.
Isn't it amazing?
It's beautiful. It's absolutely
it's
beautiful.
Awesome.
And that is actually where I picked up my park pass. So things like conservation efforts, I am excited about this. We as Canadians care deeply to put money towards keeping our parks alive and healthy.
For sure.
The second thing that caught my eye was the investment in cybersecurity. We are becoming a more digitally focused nation, and the government is going to be putting in more protective measures on their own systems and systems that carry our very, very precious data. This past year, we had so many notable breaches, Equifax to name one of them, and so this is again heightened attention around an issue that it really affects not only your digital footprint, but also your financial
absolutely
footprint.
And it's enormously important, and I'm really glad to see them put money towards the technology. It's not just a technology problem though. At the end of the day, the Equifax, I can't remember if that was specifically, but most of these were because somebody clicked on something that they shouldn't.
That's right.
And so let that be a lesson to us all.
Yeah.
Okay, Glynis Donovan asks a good question that I think we can end with, because it's right up your alley. What about people who are not literate or are on social assistance? How do they save? So like if you don't have the skills, like so much of this is layered, right? If you start off without the skills, you end up in a financial hole. It's yet harder to dig out of that when you don't have the literacy. It's not as simple for them as just clicking on a website. So,
I have to say this is a real challenge, and when I look back to my very first job, I worked for the Calgary Public Library starting at the age of 14. It was there that I learned how to make money. I read books about it. I read The Economist. I was, staying late and taking advantage of the computer systems, the books. And it was also big driver because we had no money growing up. I had both my parents back in school. Now, I'm not saying that is completely comparable, but I want to just compliment our library systems as options for people that maybe have some literary challenges or accessibility challenges. We have amazing librarians across the country that are there to help with these specific matters. And then the other part here is really liaising with community support agencies offered by the government. Please make your way over there, have discussions with what is available for you. There are credits, there is money.
And there's assistance. There's a system and a safety net that you can avail yourself of. And it's at the municipal level, it's at the provincial level, it's at the federal level. You do have to go out and find it.
Yep.
But if you go and ask, there are all kinds of people there.
That's right. And again, back to the library system, if you are unable to find your local resource center offered by the government, go into your library. They will get you there.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. I think we're going to wrap this up here. It has been my great pleasure to continue to do this. It is one of the greatest things about these Facebook Lives. It's a real interaction with our audience. I do a live television show every day, and I try to replicate a little bit of this through Twitter, but you never get that back and forth in the way that you get with this. So thanks to you guys for taking part in this. Thanks to you.
Thank you.
For being involved. We're going to put up your Twitter handle and your website and the name of a couple of your books so people can follow you and get involved in the conversation. Like I said, please continue to comment in these comment boards. I follow them. Leslie Ann will as well. And on some of those that we didn't have the answer to, I promise you we will try to get back to you on those, get answers to you. But listen, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to do this.
Thank you.
Really good questions and a lot of fun. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
It's so funny that the questions that come in really do, I think, inform. Like I'm better informed to go ahead and do my show tomorrow because I've had this interaction with, in the however many dozens of people that were banging questions at us, because they get curated. So this is